Hello again, class. This is going to be our third and final lecture in our Drafting the Constitution series. We focused on the actual process of drafting the Constitution and the issues surrounding the Constitutional Convention in prior lectures. This lecture is going to focus on the process for ratifying the Constitution. And that's a word I'll talk more about later, but it means getting the states to agree to the Constitution, to formally adopt it and accept this new form of government that the drafters had created. In a different series of lectures, we'll go into the actual terms of the Constitution itself, but this lesson is going to focus on simply the arguments back and forth on whether the states, the people who had not attended the Constitutional Convention, whether they're going to agree to the Constitution or not. Now, if you remember from, it's probably our first lecture here, 55 delegates originally attended the Constitutional Convention. They came and went, many of them came and went throughout the summer. There's actually only 42 around by the time the Constitution was going to be signed on September 17th, 1787. And out of those 42, only 39 agreed to sign it. 3 of the delegates, Edmund Randolph and George Mason from Virginia, Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts, refused to sign the Constitution. And this is going to, be a warning that not everyone in the country is going to be crazy about the Constitution. We look back at it and see that the Constitution lasted 233 years, whereas the Articles of Confederation only lasted 10 years. So we tend to assume, well, the Constitution must have something going for it. It's lasted all this time. I remember I always used to hear that our Constitution is the oldest written Constitution in the world, or at least the oldest Constitution that's been in continuous use in the world for those 233 years. I don't know for a fact that that's true, but that's what I was always taught. All right, and so we seem to think, well, the Constitution has been fairly successful in creating a stable government that's lasted this long. Surely everyone realized it was going to be superior to the Articles of Confederation, but at the time that wasn't clear at all. They couldn't see into the future, and so they didn't know if this Constitution would last or not. And so many people were upset with the Constitution for a number of reasons, and we're going to discuss those in this lesson. All right. So the Constitution's written. 39 out of the 42 delegates who are still there sign it. But again, just because 39 people write a piece of paper or write a document on a piece of paper and sign it, doesn't mean an entire nation's government is going to change just like that. The Constitution must still be ratified. Ratify means to formally agree to or to make official. Right? It's the process by which each of the 13 states are going to have a vote. Either their state legislatures or they're going to call their own convention and vote on whether to accept the Constitution or reject the Constitution. This is what we mean by ratify. If you accept it, you are ratifying the Constitution. In the Constitution, the drafters wrote in the very last article that this Constitution is going to become binding on the entire country once 9 of 13 states ratify it. Spoiler alert, all 13 states are eventually, I'm going to put emphasis on that word eventually, ratified the Constitution. I don't know what would have happened if there had really been 4 states who refused to ratify it. Again, it's all well and good that the 39 people who signed the Constitution said it would become effective on everyone in the country as soon as 9 states ratify it. But, 4 states simply refused to ratify it and refused to take part in that new government. I'm not sure what would have happened. But ultimately, again, this is a little bit of a spoiler, that's not what happened. but that's how it was set up, that only 9 of the 13 states could ratify, and then the country would treat it as having been adopted. So now we've set the groundwork and the rules, so to speak. Let the debates begin. The Constitution signed in September of 1787. Most states spend the next year, or in Rhode Island's case, the next 3 years. Again, remember, Rhode Island didn't even send anyone to the Constitutional Convention. So, the smallest of states clearly has a problem with this whole process. They didn't want the Articles of Confederation amended, apparently, because they didn't send anyone to the convention. And, it takes a while to convince them that they need to get on board with this new government and this new constitution. Again, perhaps they were thinking that since they're the smallest state, they have the most to lose once you move away from the system where every state had exactly 1 vote. Okay. Know these groups that we're about to talk about. The supporters of the Constitution were called Federalists. That's because the Constitution created a system of federalism. If you think back to our first lesson, or if you remember back to it, federalism is a system of government where the national, or what we call the federal government, shares powers with the state government. Okay, those are 2 different governments on different levels, but they're sharing powers. That's what federalism is. The sharing of power between a national, or what we usually call here in this country, a federal government, and then the sharing of powers with the state or local government. That's federalism. And so the people who supported the Constitution that created the system of federalism are called Federalists, and the people who opposed it are giving the very original name of Anti-Federalists. All right, these are the opponents of the Constitution. Anti meaning against, so either themselves or my guess is historians or people defining them called them the Anti-Federalists. It's right there in the name. You can kind of tell who's ultimately going to win this argument, but we shouldn't discount the changes that Anti-Federalists are going to cause to be instituted because of their opposition to the Constitution. So as we'll see, even though the Constitution is ultimately going to be ratified over the Anti-Federalist objection, they raise enough of an objection that they do in part get what they want, namely a Bill of Rights. The most famous proponents of the Constitution, or at least the men who are given most credit for pushing for its acceptance, are James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. We're going to discuss a series of essays they write later in this lecture. But just know those are the 3 men probably most associated with moving for ratification of the Constitution. Now, what do the Federalists generally think of the Constitution? Well, they supported the fact that the Constitution strengthened the national or the federal government. After all, remember the problems with the Articles of Confederation is that it created a federal government or a national government that was too weak to achieve anything. So the whole point of the Constitutional Convention was to strengthen the national government. It in fact did that. It certainly did that. And so the people who supported the Constitution were happy about that fact. They wanted the national or the federal government strengthened. Federalists also believed you need a relatively strong executive. Now think back to Shays' Rebellion. Okay? There was no executive branch of the national government to help put down that rebellion. There was no way for the national government to enforce its laws. All right, so the people who supported the Constitution were glad that it was creating this office of the president. So you had someone to enforce the country's laws. The Federalists also believed that a large Republican government on a national scale would protect people's rights. Now, this argument's hard to understand. I'll admit that right up front. But essentially what they were saying, and James Madison wrote a very famous essay on this, and what we call the Federalist Papers. But what they're saying is that, look, because people throughout this country, which took place, from Georgia to New Hampshire, all up and down the eastern seaboard, because people are electing representatives from all those various places that are very far away, it'd be hard for any small group to to achieve so much power that they could violate people's rights, because power is being spread among representatives from all these various parts of the country. And so they thought the fact that the country was relatively large, not nearly as large as it's going to become, obviously, but certainly large compared to Britain, they thought that was a strength of this new government, that they were going to be electing representatives from all over the East Coast, and that this would keep any group from becoming powerful enough to take away people's rights. And sort of along those lines, they did not believe that the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights. Their position was the Constitution only gives the federal government limited powers, things like regulating trade, declaring war, issuing taxes. But other than the powers that were specifically given to the government, it can't do anything else. So, to put that another way, their position was the Constitution didn't give them any powers to violate people's rights, and so you don't need to specifically spell out what those rights are. The Federalists feared that if you start spelling out people's rights and start listing the rights, once you list a few rights and get it written down, someone eventually will come along and say, oh, well, here's this other thing that's not on the list, so therefore it must not be a right. So they were afraid that by listing the rights, that you're somehow limiting people's rights. As we'll see in future lessons, when they drafted the Bill of Rights, they did find a way around this argument. But that was the Federalist initial position. All right, now what about the Anti-Federalists? All right, there we have pictures of Patrick Henry and George Mason, two of the more famous Anti-Federalists. In general, Anti-Federalists, well, as you might expect, since they're the Anti-Federalists, they're against the Federalists, believe the opposite. They wanted power to remain with the states. They also wanted a legislative branch that was going to be much stronger than the executive branch, because they feared that a strong president would start acting like a king. At the time, and for the first few decades that our government was in existence under the Constitution, I think many people, both who would have been Federalists and Anti-Federalists, believed the legislative branch under the Constitution as it's still written today, that the legislative branch was actually the more important branch. It was the one listed first. The Constitution spends much, much more time describing the powers of the legislative branch than it does the president's powers. And so I would believe even most Federalists at the time probably would have said, well, yes, even under our Constitution, the legislative branch is certainly as strong as the executive branch and probably stronger. And it seems that was George Washington's position when he was president. Washington did not take a view that the president should take an active role in legislation and things like that. Washington basically thought it was the president's job to wait until Congress, wait until the legislative branch sent him a law, and then he would either sign it or what we call veto it, which basically sort of canceled it. But Washington did not believe the president should be suggesting to Congress what laws to pass or doing things like that. So the people, I think, on both sides, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, probably thought the legislative branch was just as, if not more important than the executive branch under the Constitution. But the Anti-Federalists didn't want the president to have nearly as many powers as he was actually given under the Constitution. So that was one of their objections. And finally, and this may have been their biggest one, the Constitution, as it was originally written in 1787, did not have a Bill of Rights. And as we're going to see, they're going to demand a Bill of Rights. They weren't sympathetic to the Federalist position that, well, the Constitution doesn't say the government can violate people's rights, so I'm sure they won't do it. The Anti-Federalists are like, no, your rights need to be written down. England has had a Bill of Rights for 100 years by this time, and so they felt that the Americans should have one as well. Both groups began writing essays in newspapers, especially in New York, trying to persuade people of their point of view. Now, I say both groups, but the fact is, history tends to remember the winners of an argument or a war or a debate, and so we remember the Federalists, the essays written by the Federalists, and there were 85 of them. They were collected, or they've been collected over the years, and collectively they are known as the Federalist Papers. All right, there's a reason I put that name in bold. You must know what the Federalist Papers are: a collection of essays written in favor of the Constitution. And when you think of the Federalist Papers, you also should be reminded of Thomas Paine and Common Sense. All right, so we're seeing a pattern. All right, we've seen examples of this before. Someone, writing down their thoughts, writing a persuasive essay to try to convince people to come around to their way of thinking. First, it was Thomas Paine, writing Common Sense, trying to convince people to move for independence. That was back in 1776. And now, after the Constitution's written, but before it was ratified, the Federalist Papers are written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. John Jay, I believe, wrote 5 of them, and I think he got sick and didn't write anymore. So he tends to be out of these triplets right here, John Jay seems to be the one that's forgotten the most. He wrote 5. Hamilton and Madison combined for the other 80. And I think it comes out, I think Hamilton may have written about 50 and Madison 30, something like that. The number each of them wrote isn't particularly important for you to remember, but just understand it was about 85 essays written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. And in these essays, they reject the Anti-Federalist arguments. All right, so they're reading what the Anti-Federalists are writing in papers, and they're responding to it. And say, well, the Anti-Federalists said this, but they're wrong for these reasons. But more than just rejecting Anti-Federalist arguments, the Federalist Papers make arguments in favor of the Constitution. They explain why ratifying the Constitution is a good idea. So again, know the Federalist Papers, know that they were written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, and know they are a very important example of people writing persuasive essays in order to sway public opinion. So, and pay attention to the chart over on the right. Again, the Constitution was signed by the delegates at the convention in September 1787. And if you look over here on the right, Delaware already voted for it, by the way, unanimously, 30-0. These states had basically their own conventions where they would send delegates to vote on the Constitution. And all 30 delegates who went to the Delaware Convention voted in favor of it. And most states held votes over the next year, except, as you can see, North Carolina and Rhode Island, both of whom took longer. North Carolina took a couple years into 1789. Rhode Island stretched it into that third year of May of 1790. Now, what's funny about those votes, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. Remember, the Constitution states that it becomes effective once 9 states vote in favor of it, which technically happened when New Hampshire ratified the Constitution in June of 1788. And, you know, if you look at this chart, you can see what's happening. Look at those first few states. You know, Delaware voted 30-0 in favor of the Constitution. Pennsylvania wasn't quite that lopsided, but it was still 46-23, so they had twice as many yes votes as no votes. Then you have New Jersey. Again, it was unanimous in favor. You have Georgia, unanimous in favor. Right? So the state, well, and even keep going. Connecticut, 128-40. Right? That's pretty much a blowout too. So the states who were in favor of the Constitution, they didn't debate it very long. You see all these took place, the ones I just mentioned, all of these took place in December of 1787 or January of 1788. All right, so just a few months after the convention ended, you know, about 5 of the states were ready to vote almost immediately because it was pretty clear which way they were going. It wasn't until Massachusetts voted in 1788 that you had your first close vote. It was 187 to 168. All right, but then if you look at the bottom, you know, Rhode Island was 34-32. It only passed by 2 votes. New York, 30-27, passed by 3 votes. Virginia, 89-79, passed by 10 votes. All right, so the ones where the votes were closer, those states took the longest time to debate it. Right? And it was during really leading up to those later votes when and why the Federalist Papers were written. But what's interesting about this is that the Constitution technically becomes effective once New Hampshire ratifies it in June of 1788. And they end up having elections later that year. Right? And George Washington takes office, and the first Congress is seated in the spring of 1789. All right, so by the time North Carolina votes yes in November of 1789, and Rhode Island votes yes in 1790, the new government had been up and running for almost a year. However, even though the Constitution became effective when New Hampshire voted yes in June of 1788, the Federalists really wanted all states to agree. They wanted it to be unanimous. 13 states in favor of the Constitution, 0 states against. So the Federalists eventually agreed to add a Bill of Rights. A number of states, when they voted yes specifically on the condition that a Bill of Rights would be added. All right, so eventually the Federalists agree. So after the first congressional election, James Madison is elected to the House of Representatives and almost immediately proposes 10 amendments, which becomes known as the Bill of Rights. All right, so if you're a fan of the Bill of Rights, if you're a fan of things like free speech or not having soldiers quartered in your home, things like that, then you should say thank you to the Anti-Federalists. Because even though they lost the bigger debate, whether the Constitution was ratified or not, they achieved very, very important changes to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. But frankly, most people today, if you ask them what's in the Constitution, they'll talk about the Bill of Rights. They won't talk about the things that were written originally at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. They're going to talk about the Bill of Rights. All right? So this is what most people know of the Constitution, is the Bill of Rights. And we all have the Anti-Federalists to thank for that. So even though at the time, they probably were discouraged that the Constitution was ratified over their objections, history looks at their accomplishments pretty favorably in achieving the Bill of Rights. Finally, you don't need to write this, and I've already mentioned it. Rhode Island finally ratified the Constitution in May of 1790, and so now it was unanimous. The United States had a new Constitution and a new government. In future lessons, we will go through some of the more of the specific terms in the Constitution, and we'll go over exactly what